In the morning, when the monastery bells rang out for the first time, the guards at the main gate heard a scream so piercing that it cut through the morning fog like a knife through cloth. The voice was female, high-pitched, hoarse, and there was no plea or hope in it, only a spasm of terror. After it, everything fell silent, and only the sound of keys in iron locks reminded one that those who were not allowed to leave lived here. The convent of St. Mary, hidden behind triple walls in the old quarter of the city, was no ordinary abode. Its south wing was called the Princess's Wing. For more than half a century, it had been home to noblewomen whose fates were closely linked to European politics. They bore titles, but had no freedom. In documents of the time, they were referred to as voluntary novices, although in reality, most of them had been sent here by their fathers, brothers, or husbands. Here were the sisters of deposed kings, the widows of executed dukes, the illegitimate daughters of rulers, and even one bride rejected by the king himself in favor of a more advantageous marriage. At the head of this closed harem stood the old abbess, Agatha of Lorraine, a woman who was secretly called the keyholder of Europe. She knew too many secrets, and so she was allowed to run the convent without interference from the church authorities. But now, even her power was shaken. By the end of autumn, a fever broke out in the princess's quarters, and the first victim, the young daughter of the Duke of Savoy, died in violent convulsions, covered in spots all over her body. The first reports preserved in the city archives describe the disease as a fever with black ulcers, although at that time no one dared to utter the word plague. Doctors, summoned in secret and allowed to see only one of the sick, prescribed bloodletting and warm herbal compresses, but their advice was quickly silenced. News of an infection inside the convent could cause a political scandal. Among the nuns were brides of future alliances, and the death of even one of them threatened to disrupt diplomatic agreements. During those weeks, everyone's attention was focused on one figure in particular: Princess Isabella d'Aramon, the widow of a childless duke and niece of the King of France. She was over 40 and had spent more than 15 years within the monastery walls. Rumor had it that the king kept her there, fearing her influence on the nobility. Now, the disease had reached her chambers. The first signs were sudden weakness, a yellowish tinge to her skin, swelling of the joints, and constant thirst. According to the records of one of the monks who served the building, Isabella developed spots the color of old blood on her thighs and abdomen, and her breathing became heavy and wheezy. Touching her skin caused sharp pain, as if a fire was smoldering beneath it. The abbess ordered that she be kept in isolation and allowed only trusted sisters and a doctor brought from Lorraine to visit her. This doctor, Master Pierre Renard, described the princess's condition in his diary, which was later found among the papers of the city chancellery. Her body temperature is so high that moisture evaporates from her skin, leaving a whitish film of salt. Her pulse is uneven. Her breathing is irregular. I bled her, removing at least 1/8 of her blood, as prescribed in such cases, and applied an ointment of lard, crushed garlic, and valerian root to the ulcers in her groin. She complained of visions, claiming that her deceased husband was standing in the corner of the cell and calling her by name. Intrigue began to gather around the sick woman. A messenger arrived from Paris with a letter from the king demanding daily reports on her health. In the corridors of the palace, it was rumored that if Isabella died, her rich dowry, several estates in Burgundy would automatically pass to the crown. However, some influential relatives in Savoy insisted that the property should return to their possession. This threatened to escalate into a diplomatic conflict. The servants who served the couple began to disappear. Some were sent for treatment to distant villages. Others were found dead in the monastery garden, showing signs of the same illness. Officially, they were buried from a cold, but secret reports from city guards indicated that the bodies were black, with deep ulcers and a foul smell of decay. During those days, the monastery resembled a besieged fortress. The gates were locked with 3 bolts. Armed men stood guard on the towers, and local residents tried to avoid the street leading to the western wall. It was said that at night, coughing, moans, and quiet female cries could be heard coming from there. The abbess forbade the ringing of bells when sisters died, so as not to attract the attention of the town. Meanwhile, Isabella's condition worsened. She refused food, demanding only water and poppy seed infusion, which gave her brief respite but plunged her into delirium. Sometimes she screamed that the walls of the convent were on fire and tried to get out of bed, tearing off her bandages. Master Renard wrote, "Her eyes turned red, as if filled with blood. The smell from her mouth was unbearable. Her tongue was covered with a black coating. Her veins bulged. Her hands trembled, and the skin on her fingers began to peel off." According to eyewitnesses, 2 guards were always stationed around her bed, not for protection, but to prevent anyone from approaching without the abbess's permission. Some suspected that her death would signal a redistribution of power and land, and therefore watched everyone who entered her chambers. On the evening of the 25th day of her illness, a heavy smell of burning hung over the monastery. The bedding and clothes of the deceased sisters were being burned in the kitchen stove. The bodies were taken away at night in closed carts drawn by novice monks. One of the city guards' reports states, "I saw a body covered with a tarpaulin being taken out of the convent, with rats moving beneath it." It was then, according to one of the maids, that rumors began to spread in the corridors that the illness was only a pretext, and that in reality, those who stood in the way of the king's plans were being quietly eliminated in the princess's quarters. By the end of the second week of winter, the smell of decay in the south wing of the monastery had become so strong that even the soldiers, accustomed to the sight of wounded men on the battlefield, asked the abbess for vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs to stand guard at the doors. A warm, suffocating odor emanated from the walls, and on frosty days, steam rose from the narrow windows of the cells, as if the building were breathing the heavy, hot breath of a dying man. Princess Isabella no longer got out of bed. Her body was emaciated, but her stomach and legs were so swollen that the skin stretched and threatened to tear. The skin on her feet had turned black, and her nails began to peel off. Master Renard tried twice more to bleed her, each time drawing a cup of dark, thick blood with the smell of iron. But there was no relief. On the contrary, after each procedure, Isabella began to shake, and her lips turned blue. In his notes, he wrote, "Her pulse is weak, her breathing is wheezy, her tongue is like stone. The ulcers on her thigh and armpit are deep, with grey edges and a black crust in the center. When pressed, a thick liquid oozes out, the color of rancid oil. She complains that she hears the footsteps of her uncle, who died 10 years ago, behind the walls. Her eyes are cloudy. Her pupils barely react to light." Meanwhile, Outside the convent, the rumors were growing. Letters with seals from Savoy and Paris arrived almost daily, but the Mother Superior opened them only in her cell, showing them to no one. Rumors circulated that the king intended to send his trusted cardinal to the monastery to take control of the situation and take Isabella to the castle, where she would sign a document transferring the lands. The Savoy relatives hurried to send their people to prevent this. Tension grew inside the princess's quarters. Some of the nuns begged to be transferred to other convents, while others whispered that Isabella's death would free up her room and the privileges associated with her position. According to a report from one of the city guards, in the 3rd week of the illness, a cart pulled up to the convent from which 2 men in dark cloaks carried out a wooden chest. It was brought into the building, and all the gates were immediately closed. Later it turned out that the chest did not contain clothes, but supplies, dried herbs, jugs of wine, and several bottles of a thick liquid that Master Renard used to moisten bandages. Soon after, he began to apply a new ointment made of honey, crushed lead, and powdered dried toads. But the patient's condition only worsened. The servants who cared for the princess fell ill one after another. 2 girls died within 3 days, and their bodies were carried out at night. The abbess ordered the cracks in the windows and doors to be sealed, and copper bowls with smouldering coals were placed in the corridors, onto which resin and juniper was sprinkled in an attempt to mask the smell. But in reality, the smoke only intensified the stench and suffocation. At the same time, news reached the convent that preachers had appeared in the city, accusing the abbess of hiding God's punishment. They said that the plague in the princess's quarters was punishment for pride and bloodshed, and demanded that the gates be opened so that God's judgment might be fulfilled. Isabella, not understanding what was happening outside the walls, fell into delirium more and more often. She called out to her dead husband, whispered prayers interspersed with threats, and once, according to a servant, began to scream that someone was putting earth from the cemetery in her food. After that, she refused to eat at all. She subsisted only on diluted wine and decoctions brought to her by Master Renard. In the 4th week, the disease reached a stage where the skin on her hands and feet began to peel off in large patches, exposing moist, dark red muscle tissue. The fingers on her right hand turned black and began to dry out. The doctor tried to bandage them with resin and cloth, but the smell of decay was so strong that it was impossible to stay in the room without a cloth over one's face. At that time, a small retinue from Savoy arrived in the city. They demanded to see Isabella, but the abbess categorically refused, citing the danger of infection. In fact, she feared that her relatives would take her away from the king's influence. In response, the Savoyards tried to bribe the guards, but the guards, realizing that disobedience would mean the gallows, refused. In the evening of one of those days, the body of a young novice was found in the courtyard of the monastery with a blue stripe on his neck, a clear sign of strangulation. It was officially announced that he had died of weakness in the chest, but everyone understood that this was a warning to those who would try to take information outside the walls. Isabella's condition became critical. Her breathing was hoarse, her hands trembled in fits, and her eyes rolled back. Master Renard wrote, "The body accepts neither food nor drink. The heart beats, but intermittently. The face is contorted with convulsions. I fear that death will come in her sleep, and no one will know the exact hour. But death did not come. Instead, the illness seemed to keep her on the brink, prolonging her agony, and with it, the struggle between those who were waiting for her end. By the end of the 5th week of her illness, the south wing of the monastery resembled a morgue, where the living no longer ventured. The corridors were deserted, the doors of many cells remained locked for days, and only occasionally was the silence broken by coughing, a faint knock on the wall, or a sound like scratching. No one was trying to hide the fact that the disease was wiping out the princesses. The only question was who would live to see spring. Princess Isabella d'Aramon lay motionless as if she had already crossed the threshold but had not yet departed. Her skin had taken on a grey-green hue, and her veins stood out as dark strands. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked, and with each breath, a dull, sticky sound escaped from them, as if there was liquid in her chest. Her breathing was so rare that in the intervals between breaths, it seemed as if she had died. Master Renard, who had already lost faith in the treatment, merely changed her bandages and moistened her lips with a rag soaked in diluted wine. In his diary, he wrote, "The smell in her cell is a mixture of rotting flesh and old iron. Her face resembles a wax mask, but with spots that change color from yellow to black. The skin on her right leg has burst, and a sticky liquid oozes from the wound, with a smell that makes my head spin. She hardly responds to words. Sometimes, opening her eyes, she stares at the ceiling, moves her lips, and whispers, 'Names I don't know.'" Meanwhile, the king's guards gathered at the monastery gates. Their arrival was no secret. For a week, people in the city had been saying that the king had ordered Isabella to be taken to the castle for proper care. But everyone understood that it was about her signature on the documents transferring the lands. The abbess, Agatha of Lorraine, closed the gates and cited the danger of infection, but preparations were already underway in the courtyard. Armed novice monks, boards to nail the doors shut, and a vat of boiling water at the gate. That same night, a group of people from Savoy secretly approached the convent. Their leader, the brother of Isabella's late husband, brought a letter bearing the seal of the Duke of Savoy. The letter demanded that the princess be handed over to the protection of her native home, and threatened that in case of refusal, Savoy would break its trade agreements with France. The abbess did not open the gates for them either. Scuffles broke out inside the convent. Several sisters close to the Savoy side tried to sneak into Isabella's chambers at night, but they were stopped by the king's guards. Rumor has it that one of the women disappeared, and in the morning, a piece of her clothing soaked in blood was found in the garden. At this time, the disease had progressed to the stage of putrefaction while she was still alive. The fingers on Isabella's right hand fell off one by one, leaving bare knuckles. Her feet were completely blackened, and Master Renard, his voice trembling, admitted that the tissue was already dead. Under normal circumstances, he would have recommended amputation, but now it was pointless. Death was approaching the body from the periphery to the heart. The notes of one of the maids, found years later, read, "When I lifted her arm to change the bandage, the skin fell away like wet cloth, and I saw white, dry tendons. She did not scream, only moaned, quietly, almost silently. The room was so hot from the smoldering coals that sweat ran down my back, but I was still trembling." More and more people gathered outside the gates. Royal soldiers and Savoyards stood in camps separated by a narrow road, but no one dared to storm the castle. Townspeople brought news that the Archbishop's intervention was already being discussed in the cathedral, fearing that the siege would turn into bloodshed. On the evening of the 6th week of her illness, Isabella was visited by the abbess. A maid who had been eavesdropping at the door later reported that the abbess had leaned close to the princess's ear and whispered that it was time to surrender to the will of God and sign the papers so as not to leave the land to the infidels. There was no answer, but an hour later, Master Renard noticed that the princess was trying to push away the inkwell he had been told to prepare. That night, screams rang out from the monastery. Several people were trying to climb over the wall. The guards opened fire with crossbows. In the morning, 2 bodies were found at the moat, but neither side claimed them. In Isabella's cell, neither vinegar nor tar could hide the smell of decay. The body became a source of stench that spread through the corridors. Several sisters began to complain of nausea and dizziness, and the abbess ordered the south wing to be completely locked up, leaving only the doctor and 2 servants with the sick girl. But the tighter the siege grew inside and outside, the clearer it became. The question was no longer whether Isabella would survive, but who would get her body and her signature. At the end of the 7th week, the illness ceased to obey even the passage of time. Days and nights merged together, because in the south wing, the bells for services could no longer be heard, and footsteps on the stone floors sounded rare and hollow. Isabella d'Aramon lay as if frozen in a strange, agonizing wait. Her eyes no longer closed completely. Dark mucus gathered in the corners, and her breathing became barely noticeable. Master Renard wrote, "Her heart beats so slowly that I count the pauses between beats on my fingers. Her body is cold from the knees down, and the skin on her shins and feet has turned into a black crust. The smell is so strong that I have to hold a rag soaked in the vinegar in my hand. Her lips are cracked and bleeding, and her tongue seems to be dead. But she is still in this world, and that is more painful than death." Meanwhile, outside, the situation was coming to a head. The royal guard, having received orders from the monarch himself, began to prepare for an assault. They dragged a massive battering ram to the gates, and armed monks appeared on the walls of the building, holding hooks and spears in their hands. The Savoyards, not wanting to give up the initiative, set fire to part of the western wall under cover of night, hoping to distract the defenders and get inside. That night, the noise and cries merged with the internal moans of the sick. In the smoke and confusion, several armed men managed to break through the back passage leading to the monastery garden. They headed straight for the south wing. The abbess, upon learning of this, ordered the corridor leading to Isabella's cell to be closed immediately, and 2 guards with crossed halberds to be posted at the door. But the door opened anyway, not for the armed men, but for the doctor. Master Renard, realizing that the princess's last hours had come, insisted on being with her. He wrote, "Her body is shaking slightly. Her breathing has become gurgling, as if water is rising from the depths of her chest. Lead-colored spots have appeared on her face. She is looking at the ceiling, but her eyes no longer see. She moves her lips with difficulty, and I can only hear a few words. Cold, keys, door." It seems she understands something. At that moment, 2 of the king's guards burst into the cell with a parchment and a pen. They demanded that Isabella, even in her condition, sign the document with a cross. The abbess stood in the corner, watching. The doctor protested, but one of the guards pinned him against the wall. The princess, barely breathing, raised her hand, but the pen fell from her fingers. Then one of the soldiers took her hand and tried to draw on the parchment. At that moment, her body arched in a violent spasm. A rattle escaped from her mouth, and everything fell silent. A maid who witnessed the scene later said in her testimony, "She died with her eyes open. They were glassy, and for a moment it seemed to me that she could see her hands touching the paper." After Isabella's death, her cell was immediately locked. The royal party claimed that the signature had been made, while the Savoyards claimed that it had not. A brawl broke out right in the courtyard of the monastery. In the commotion, the princess's body was carried out through a side door, covered with a coarse cloth. But on the way to the carriage, it slipped from the bearer's hands, and several witnesses claimed that a black liquid spilled onto the snow, leaving a stain that did not disappear until spring. That night, the monastery was half looted. The princess's quarters were emptied. Some of the nuns were taken to different convents, while others simply disappeared. Master Renard left his last entry, "I have seen death, but never like this. It was not like a candle going out, but like a wall collapsing. And with it, the whole dark fortress collapsed." The death of Princess Isabella d'Aramon was not the end, but the beginning of events that shook half of the courts of Europe. As soon as her body was taken outside the monastery walls, the royal and Savoy sides began to argue openly about whether the document had been signed. On the same day, the royal heralds announced that the lands of Burgundy were passing under the direct control of the crown. Savoy, in response, declared that the document was forged, and the signature was a crude forgery made by an outsider. The city, which had been gripped by fear of disease just the day before, was now filled with crowds. People flocked to the monastery gates, demanding that the body be shown before burial. Whispers spread that her hands and feet had rotted away during her lifetime, and that this was God's punishment for her pride. Others, on the contrary, saw her painful death as proof of her innocence and sacrifice. The archbishop, who arrived on the third day after her death, ordered that the body be embalmed before the funeral. But when the embalmers opened the shroud, they found that the fabric had already decomposed in several places, and her hands and feet had fallen off at the joints. The smell was so strong that the procedure had to be carried out wearing half-masks soaked in herbs. The archbishop's report, preserved in a copy, states, "The body was not suitable for complete preservation. The internal organs were decomposed, the skin on the chest was peeling off in layers, and there was dark moisture with a strong, foul odor inside the cavities. For this reason, embalming was only partially carried out, and the remains were placed in a lead coffin. The funeral took place secretly, at night. The coffin was taken away, accompanied by 10 guards and 2 monks, and buried in the cemetery of the Monastery of St. Luke, far from the city. Neither side was officially present to avoid provocation. After the funeral, Savoy began to prepare troops to move to the border, claiming that the princess's death was the result of deliberate imprisonment and deprivation of medical care. The King of France responded by strengthening the garrisons at the border fortresses and announcing that the Monastery of St. Mary, as a hotbed of unrest and contagion, would be disbanded. A month after Isabella's death, the monastery was deserted. The nuns who had survived the illness were distributed among various convents, some of them sent to such remote places that they were never heard of again. The princess's quarters were boarded up, and a year later they burned down in a fire whose cause was never determined. Isabella remained an ambiguous figure in the popular imagination. For some, she was a martyr, deprived of her freedom and dying in captivity. For others, she was a dangerous schemer, whose death paved the way for new possessions for the king. Songs about her suffering began to be sung in some monasteries, but the Vatican never officially recognized them. In medical treatises of the following century, Isabella's case was mentioned as an example of prolonged decay of the body with fever and ulcers, and some doctors claimed that her illness was one of the early outbreaks of the plague in the region, which was concealed for political reasons. Thus, her death marked both the end of the old seclusion and the beginning of open games between dynasties. And the city long remembered that winter when the lights burned behind the thick walls of the monastery, and no one knew that within those walls a woman was dying, whose signature could have changed the map of Europe.